Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight from the nation's capital, Hegseth under new pressure. The Pentagon Inspector General set to deliver a report on the Defense Secretary's infamous Signalgate scandal, the group chat that exposed highly sensitive operational secrets. Stand by for new details. Also, you get a pardon. Days after getting a convicted cocaine trafficker released from prison, President Trump announcing that he is now letting a high-profile Democrat off the hook. We'll have details. And playing his chips, Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang on Capitol Hill today. He's about to bag a major lobbying win on export controls. We'll have news. And breaking tonight, Jack Smith, the former special counsel, subpoenaed. We'll have more on that ahead. But we begin this evening with the White House continuing to defend the deadly strike in the Caribbean, with President Trump just moments ago saying that land strikes, again, could be next. Joining us now from the White House North Lawn is Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan. Kate, it's great to have you. The president tonight, again, facing questions about Secretary Pete Hegseth. What can you tell us?
Yeah, that's right. So the White House really continues to defend and stand behind Pete Hegseth as he's facing increasing scrutiny over his role in these military strikes that took place on September 2nd. This has really dominated the week here at the White House so far, after the Washington Post reported that Hegseth gave a verbal order to kill everybody aboard a boat that was thought to be smuggling drugs, which led to 2 survivors of the first strike being killed in the second strike. Lawmakers are really ramping up the pressure and continue to ask for more answers and details over what happened. And some lawmakers are suggesting that a war crime could have been committed with that second strike. Trump was just asked about this moments ago in the Oval Office. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
I think you're going to find that this is war, that these people were killing our people. I think you're going to find that there's a very receptive ear to doing exactly what they're doing, taking out those boats. And very soon we're going to start doing it on land too, because we know every route, we know every house, we know where they manufacture this crap, we know where they put it all together, and I think you're going to see it very soon on land also. I support the decision to knock out the boats.
And you can see there, standing behind him, are some of the country's, the executives from some of the country's largest automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. So the big event at the White House today was Trump announcing that they're rolling back these Biden-era fuel efficiency standards. This is, the White House argues, a way to lower consumer costs for Americans.
Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan with a lot to talk about this evening, reporting live from the White House. Kate, thank you so much. Also impacting tonight, the Pentagon Inspector General set to drop a report publicly, months in the making, into the scandal now known as Signalgate. With Bloomberg News reporting today, the watchdog found Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth may have put American troops at risk when he shared attack plans on the messaging app from his personal phone. Joining us now here with more details, the man behind that story, Bloomberg Pentagon reporter Tony Capaccio. Tony, it's great to have you here. What's going to come of this report?
So before noon tomorrow on DODIG.mil, the report will drop. It'll be parsed to death because there's a lot of coulds and maybes. It's not definitive. All the media were pretty much getting the information from a limited number of people who saw the report or gave their impression of it.
Sure.
The whole notion of endangering troops, it comes from the issue of the material that Hegseth did receive from the CENTCOM commander, then General Eric Kurilla, was classified at the secret level. These were attack plans and timing plans on Houthi targets in Yemen. And then the issue of the signal, what was put on signal and whether it was properly classified or not. The issue the IG raised was if that information was intercepted by a foreign power that could endanger U.S. troops. That's where the headline comes from. So that could is going to be parsed to death by his defenders and his detractors. The Pentagon IG did acknowledge that he had the power, he had the authority to declassify information, but they didn't get into whether he did it improperly or properly. That's one of those very gray areas that will be parsed. But then the whole notion, they did say he violated Defense Department policy by using his own personal device or phone for Signalgate chats. He did. There was the one with Rubio and the Director of National Intelligence and J.D. Vance, the Vice President. Then there was a second one with 13 people, including his wife and brother. So that'll be parsed in terms of how much declassified detail was disclosed on both channels. Yeah. His detractors will say, hey, he violated procedure, but we'll see. Then the Pentagon, though, and Sean Parnell, total exoneration. Total was in uppercase.
Okay.
So we'll see how this plays out. The key thing I think I'm going to be looking for is what statement the IG makes in terms of the extent to which they bent over backwards in the public interest to put out as much as they could versus putting it under classified or this ubiquitous controlled unclassified information, CUI label.
Understood. Tony, this is great reporting, and we thank you for bringing it to us here ahead of a redacted public release tomorrow. Tony Capaccio, we thank you. As mentioned, the reported incident has spurred investigations from Republican-led House and Senate committees after allegations of possible war crimes. Let's get back to the matter in Venezuela now. Last evening, we spoke with the chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Republican Senator Rand Paul, about the incident that Kate Sullivan described, the double-tap strike on the alleged drug boat. Here's what he said.
There has to be an investigation, and I am glad that for a change there is a bipartisan push from the Armed Services Committee to get to the bottom of this. So there'll be an investigation. I think he needs to be asked under oath, did you give the order to kill any survivors? And if you didn't give the order, what was the order? Why did the admiral think that he was supposed to kill people clinging to wreckage?
Joining us now with his perspective from across the aisle, Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, who's ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, as well a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, it's great to have you with us here. You just heard from the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee hearing, and I'm wondering if you share the same thoughts and if you think a war crime may have been committed.
Well, I certainly share the thoughts that the chairman of my committee, Rand Paul, has about this incident. There's no question we need to get more facts as to exactly what Secretary Hegseth knew, what sort of orders did he give, why the admiral made the decision that he made. Certainly, we need to have a bipartisan investigation through the Armed Services Committee, which I serve on. One thing that would certainly clear all this up is to actually look at the videotape of the strike and the second strike. That hasn't been provided. If nothing happened, if there's nothing to see there, they could easily put that information out. They have not, so that only raises more questions, despite repeated attempts from myself and others to get that information. The Department of Defense is simply not providing that. But if the facts are as they have been presented are indeed true, it is incredibly troubling. If you have folks in the water that survived an initial strike that were clinging to wreckage, they pose no imminent threat to any service member. To then launch another strike to kill those individuals is a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It's a war crime. It's something that's unacceptable. And whoever ordered that would be held liable for that decision. If the facts are the way they've been presented, and we've got to get those facts, it is a horrible situation and clearly one that's unacceptable. And someone has to step up and take responsibility. And I'm disappointed that the Secretary of Defense is not willing to take some responsibility for this. It's not unusual. He usually always points the finger at other people. In committee, when we confirmed him at the Armed Services Committee, he kept pounding his fist like we need to have accountability in the Department of Defense. But apparently he doesn't believe that he has to be accountable. Everyone else has to be accountable. He's going to point fingers, but he's going to try to deflect that to someone else. But this is a serious issue. It's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. When we go to war, I served in the Navy. When you go into combat, we're all trained as folks in the military that you have to abide by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and attacking unarmed folks who are not an imminent threat, like people at sea hanging on to wreckage, that is unacceptable.
Senator, you've said that if Secretary Hegseth or any other person gave illegal orders, that they need to be held accountable. What would accountability look like in your view?
Well, I mean, they would be held accountable for a war crime and could be punished under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it's a serious charge. You know, folks, it's questionable. Are we at a war, or was this a police operation? You know, Homeland Security, we're about border security, and if folks are running drugs, the civil law enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security would be in charge there, not the Department of Defense. So if it's not a war and this strike was illegal, then that's defined as actually murder. So I think a lot of JAGs and other legal folks have said we probably, if the facts are the way they've been presented, we either have a case of murder or we have a case of a war crime. Neither one is any good. Wow. They're horrible crimes.
Yeah, that's quite a set of options, Senator. We'd like to cover a couple of different topics with you here, and I'd like to get to the matter of health care and a promised vote for next week. I believe it's the 10th of December. John Thune said there'd be a floor vote up or down on either extending the Obamacare subsidies, and I understand that there might be a Democratic bill that's ready to roll with a 3-year extension in length. Is that what you anticipate you will be voting on, or will it be something different, a piece of legislation, for instance, from Bill Cassidy to replace Obamacare?
Well, you know, I think we would all like to deal with the situation in the long term, and that means making some reforms. We are open to that. I would hope that we would have good faith negotiations with my Republican colleagues to pass a bill of that nature. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that. I'm very disappointed by that. So at a minimum, we should extend these tax credits because basically, you know, let's be real about this. We're going to have the rug pulled out from underneath millions of Americans. Nearly 10 million people are probably going to lose health insurance. The other ones are going to see massive increases in their cost, and that simply should not happen. We can make sure that they can continue to get health coverage for the next year or more, while we come together in a bipartisan way to address some of the long-term issues related to affordable health care. But, you know, so far my Republican colleagues have not come forward with any kind of substantive issues or substantive proposals. I hope they do. Perhaps that'll happen in the next week. But every day that goes by, I become increasingly concerned that that's not going to happen, and we're not going to be able to help folks who are going to have the rug pulled out from underneath them in just a few weeks.
Senator, given how difficult it appears it will be to come to some agreement on these subsidies, in retrospect, was it right for Democrats to end the recent government shutdown without coming to some sort of conclusion on this issue?
Well, I certainly wanted to do that. You know, I voted to continue to push Republicans to come to the table. Some of my colleagues had a different view, and that's what happens where we all have to represent the people in our state the way that we believe is best, and everybody has a different perspective. But I believe that we should have continued to push more aggressively to at least get a short-term extension. You know, my proposal I put out that had broad support was a 1-year extension, just so that folks would know over the next year they could continue to have affordable health care. And 1 year should give us plenty of time to come together as Democrats and Republicans, work in a bipartisan way. I take that very seriously. I work in a bipartisan way every single day, and have had more bills passed over the last 3 Congresses than any other senator, and I've done that nearly in every case bipartisan. So it can be done. We had the time, but we didn't have the time in 2 or 3 weeks. But you shouldn't bring this issue up when people are looking at losing their health coverage in just a matter of weeks, and then pull the rug out from underneath them and say, too bad, let's give them some more time, and then let's do our job and get that job and do it right before the end of next year.
Fascinating. If that said, if you get an agreement on health care, do we avoid a government shutdown at the end of January? And I'll ask you conversely, do we shut down if you don't?
Well, you know, we have a lot of appropriations bills. I mean, basically, it's about getting our appropriations bills done. We have a number of them that have already passed through the Senate. We have worked in a bipartisan way to pass a long list of appropriations bills. I'm hoping we can get those sent to the House, and the House works in good faith and also passes appropriations bill that will continue to fund the government through the next fiscal year. So we have time to get that done. I hope we all lock arms and say, let's do our job as members of Congress. And to be fundamental, the job is to keep the doors open in government and to make sure the services are provided to the people of this country.
Fascinating, Senator. It's great to have you back, and we would love to hear more about your conversation tomorrow with the Admiral. Gary Peters of Michigan, thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Quick breaking news here on the terminal. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, now under discussion to also lead the National Economic Council at the White House. This just crossed the terminal and is a headline that we'll be exploring as President Trump tries to come up with his decision finally on naming a new Fed chair that could impact some of these positions. Coming up as well, a close special congressional election in Tennessee, close according to some, is putting Republicans on high alert ahead of next year's midterm election. We'll discuss it all with Bloomberg's Nia-Malika Henderson, columnist with Bloomberg Opinion, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Amara Omokwe. And new ADP data out today shows that U.S. company payrolls fell by the most since 2023, with private sector payrolls decreasing by 32,000. However, this data did little to alter bets that the Fed will cut rates in its final policy meeting of 2025 next week, driving U.S. stocks higher. For a look into how markets responded, let's turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins live from World Headquarters in New York.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those ADP numbers here, Amara. I mean, one of the cold, hard truths about financial markets is that sometimes what's bad for Main Street ends up being good for Wall Street. You take a look at the gains on the board. They look modest, to be sure, but you're talking about an S&P 500 that's really only about 30 points away from reclaiming its recent all-time high. And the moves higher that we saw today, as well as yesterday, seem to be tied directly to that economic data and the idea that that economic data is soft enough that the Fed will indeed follow through with the rate cut 1 week from today at its next meeting and continue those rate cuts into 2026. That's been a big catalyst for the moves that we saw higher here on the day for all of the major indices. Treasuries were kind of stuck in a little bit more of a tight range as some of this had already been priced in to the bond market, but that could shift in a big way. I do want to highlight one big move that we saw today that sort of got buried, and that was the move down in the dollar. And this is going to be a big issue for all you folks down there in Washington. Well, I know the Trump administration has kind of made it clear that it actually kind of favors, to a certain extent, a slightly weaker dollar. We haven't seen it this week in years, decades. In fact, right now it's on pace for a decline on a year-to-date basis of more than 7%. Other than that outlier year back in 2017, this would be one of the biggest weakening that we've seen in the dollar on an annual basis, quite frankly, in the last 30 years or so. That's going to have a big impact on asset prices, as a weaker dollar actually makes non-U.S. assets a little bit more attractive. And, of course, the other big story out there, Amara and Joe, of course, today was what we've been seeing in the AI space. Earlier this morning, we got rattled a bit. There was a story out of The Information that seemed to suggest that the AI adoption wasn't going as fast as possible. This seemed to be tied to some concern that Microsoft salespeople had actually not met some of their AI targets earlier this year. There was some commentary from the Anthropic CEO saying that spending might have got a little out of hand. A story about Morgan Stanley looking to sort of pass off some of the risk of the lending that is done for AI infrastructure. But then, I don't know, just a little bit more than an hour ago, we got earnings out of Salesforce, which has made a huge push into the agentic AI space. And 3 months ago, they rattled markets because they said that adoption wasn't going fast enough. They came out today just a little while ago and said, well, guess what? It's actually picked up. Investors like what they heard, and they bid those shares up higher in the after-hours trade.
Incredible. Getting whiplash from these headlines when it comes to AI, Romaine. Thank you. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick with Power Moves. Meantime, last night, Republicans averted an upset in Tennessee, a special election for a U.S. House seat, with Matt Van Epps, the Trump-backed Republican candidate, taking victory. But the single-digit result in a district that Donald Trump won by more than 20 points indicates to some the Democrats' central economic message has some resonance across the political spectrum, as the Democratic candidate in this case campaigned on the issue of affordability and performed far better than expected in a typically solid red seat. But as Democrats continue their soul-searching mission ahead of next year's midterm elections, the party has been trying to understand why rural voters have turned away from their party in favor of Republicans In a new Bloomberg opinion piece, Nia-Malika explores this question. She's with us now, Nia. It's great to see you. I'm just curious your thoughts on a race that we all want to make a bellwether, right? Yeah. That's what we all do, is look for a trend. And you're finding some pretty important trends in your column. But people are extending this to the midterms to say, hey, if you shrunk the margin by 15 points, we're going to have a blue wave in the midterms. Do Democrats risk complacency here if that's the conversation today?
Listen, they are certainly bullish now, and you have Republicans sounding the alarm, particularly Republicans from Tennessee sort of talking on the House about what this could mean going forward in some of these other races. What's interesting about this is in a red state, of course, and it speaks to, in some ways, the deficiencies that Democrats have in some of these red states, that the sort of party apparatus, and this is kind of what I talk about in the column, isn't great. So the candidate they ended up fielding here loses by 9, probably would have been more competitive if you had a candidate who was more able to connect with some of those voters. She was a little bit radical. Her own admission was like, oh, I'm really radical on some of these issues. Smart of her, though, I think, to focus on affordability. Her campaign slogan, feed the kids, fix the roads, and fund the hospitals, right? And that's something, it meets people where they live, particularly in some of these states in the South, where you're going to see some real issues around affordability of health care in particular. So in that way, I think you can draw some lessons that Democrats need to learn from this race, but also some warning signs, too, for Republicans.
So what is the takeaway from Republicans? Because President Trump got really involved, was very vocal in support of the Republican candidate, and the Republican candidate really aligned himself with President Trump. Is there a lesson about sort of the staying power of President Trump's influence
here? So one of the things that's interesting here is, you did have Donald Trump endorsing him, but what was interesting was there were no ads from the GOP on the airwaves that mentioned Donald Trump, that made this argument that you needed to send somebody to D.C. to help Donald Trump's agenda, right? So in that way, he didn't exactly wrap himself in Donald Trump, and part of the reason is that you question, like, what is Donald Trump's real agenda, right? Are people much better off than they were a year ago with Donald Trump's promises about changing inflation and lowering grocery prices? None of that has really happened. And you see, I think, in President Trump, someone who isn't out and about in the way that he used to be. He's not really doing a lot of rallies. He was, what was the cabinet meeting 2 hours yesterday? He was there talking about lowering emission standards with cars. Great, but guess what? The average car price is $50,000. That is a record, and that is sort of the reality that people are living with and wondering, what is the president going to do about the economy, something he campaigned on, something he won on, and now many Americans are giving him very poor marks in terms of what he's been able to do.
Getting back to your original point, though, you've got Democrats, in some cases, claiming a moral victory here because it wasn't a 22-point spread. You're sounding a note of caution by way of saying it could have been tighter.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the Democratic Party has kind of turned its back on some of these southern states and some of these sort of rural voters, some of whom are African American, some of whom are white Americans as well. It's much more diverse than you would think in some of these rural states and red states. And this wasn't exactly a rural district. Sure. It had some parts of Nashville as well. But yeah, there are lessons I think that Democrats need to learn in terms of rebuilding the party that has in some ways been wiped out, particularly in some of these red states.
Does that include embracing country music? That's what Donald Trump called her out for.
That's right.
Maybe the lessons learned.
How do you say, who doesn't? Beyonce. We all have country music.
Halfway Carter.
Nashville's in your district.
Yes. Yeah.
Nia, thank you so much. Bloomberg opinion columnist Nia-Malika Henderson. Look for the column on the Terminal and online. Coming up, much more on the breaking news crossing now on the Terminal involving Scott Bessent, an additional role that he soon may be tapped for at the White House. It's all ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew with breaking news in Washington. It just crossed the Terminal after we took air this evening on Bloomberg. There could be a new help wanted sign going up at the White House, of course, if Donald Trump chooses Kevin Hassett to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve. That's the expectation. And if he does, Donald Trump's aides and allies are now discussing the possibility of making Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent the top White House economic advisor, jumping in to fill the place of Kevin Hassett. If indeed he does go to the Federal Reserve, this would make him not only Treasury Secretary, but also leading the White House National Economic Council. This is Amara's day job, covering the Federal Reserve and the related agencies that we're talking about here within the White House. This would be a pretty big deal. Does Scott Bessent have time for two jobs?
I mean, that would be a big question, but I think what this reporting reflects is how trusted Scott Bessent has become in President Trump's eyes. He was leading the interview process for the Fed chair search. Of course, he's running point on many of the administration's economic priorities, tariffs, you name it. And he's also been one of the chief defenders of President Trump's economic agenda. Earlier in the administration, he was saying he wouldn't come out and talk about Fed policy. He wouldn't come out and talk about the need for the Fed to lower rates. But now we hear him talking about the Fed all the time, talking about the need for institutional reform. So that just shows how much of a champion he is for the president's economic agenda. And so this reporting actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, so if we're getting news like this from Nancy Cook, does that mean Kevin Hassett actually has the job? She's reporting is at the top of the list.
I mean, that's what our Bloomberg reporting
would not be
shows,
a surprise.
that Kevin Hassett is the front runner, that he has kind of taken the lead among these last 5 candidates that remain. And it makes sense. Again, he has been lockstep with President Trump on the need for the Fed to lower interest rates. Pretty much on every economic issue, Kevin Hassett has been lockstep with the president.
Really interesting. We'll see where this goes.
Yeah, we will.
Maybe we'll find out more this week. Nancy reporting that, of course, Trump has hinted at announcing Hassett as the next Fed chair, but we may not know based on what he said just a couple of days ago until early next year. Another big story tonight in Washington, the Nvidia boss, Jensen Huang, back in town, meeting with President Trump to discuss export controls after visiting with lawmakers to answer questions about AI and export controls in the form of legislation. For details, we turn now to Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, live here in our Washington bureau. You were with Jensen Huang earlier today. He succeeded in his quest.
In a way, he did.
Is that true?
He had a whirlwind tour here through Washington, and he did come away with a victory. And it may have been baked in the cake already, Joe, even before he touched down in D.C. And that was that Nvidia succeeded in beating back this provision that was floated as being an addition to the defense bill that has to pass before year's end. And this would have restricted NVIDIA's ability to sell its advanced AI chips to China and other adversaries. Now, NVIDIA had argued that it wasn't necessary, that the Commerce Department has all the authority that it needs to do exactly that. And it also has said that, look, trying to make us give preference to American customers over customers, say, in China is really unnecessary, too, because there is no shortage when it comes to meeting demand. So they were able to fend that off. They did not, it appears, succeed in getting this AI regulation moratorium also attached to the defense bill. But that was not quite as big a priority as the GAIN Act when it came to chips controls.
On the issue of exporting these advanced chips to China, is it a smooth glide path from here, or are there still potential roadblocks for NVIDIA?
Well, Mara, that's a great question, because you would think that maybe this might open the path, but the path is far from clear. For one, lawmakers may try again next year on this. There are still a lot of concerns among senators and representatives from both parties on this question of whether NVIDIA should be allowed to sell into China. And we heard Mike Rounds, after Jensen Huang met with the Senate Banking Committee, saying, hey, yes, we heard him out. We understand they want to compete in a lot of other markets, but we are concerned about China. Now, the administration has floated this idea internally of possibly allowing NVIDIA to sell an earlier generation of chips known as the H200 to Chinese customers. But Jensen Huang said today, interestingly, that he's not sure China would even accept those if the clearance were granted. So it'll be interesting to see how Beijing receives that, if the U.S. even grants that approval, and then what happens next. Jensen has pushed the administration to clear its latest line, the Blackwells, perhaps in a deprecated form for the China market, to see if maybe there would be some buyers there. As Jensen said, though, in a chat this evening, he's doing yet another event, Joe, this one at CSIS. He noted that they are currently banned from China by both the U.S. and China, because Chinese authorities have said no thank you to another generation of their AI chips.
Boy, another whirlwind tour of the nation's capital with Jensen Huang. Did he have a suit on or the leather jacket?
Oh, he traded the suit. He traded the leather jacket for a suit.
That's the new Washington uniform.
And he was signing autographs outside the Senate
Is that true?
Committee room. Yes,
he's signing autographs in Washington. Absolutely fascinating. So you got to go there to know that kind of stuff. Shep, thank you. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard with a great update on Jensen Huang. We'll be tracking Nvidia shares as we make our way through the after-hours session. And turning back now to the continued fallout from the strikes in Venezuela, the story that won't seem to go away, with the White House again facing questions. Secretary Hegseth tonight, a story that just continues to hang over the administration. Joining us now with her insight is Ashley Davis, partner at S3 Group, a Republican strategist, also former Homeland Security official in the George W. Bush administration. It's great to see you. I wonder your thoughts on this, knowing that we're talking potentially about war crimes here. You're pretty close to the Senate. The Senate Armed Services Committee is investigating this. They're going to be talking to the Admiral tomorrow, who ordered that second strike. What's going to come from that conversation?
Well, I would rather talk about leather jackets and Kevin Hegseth, but I'm happy to talk about Venezuela. But listen, I think there's two concerns that I have. One, that I hate that we're going directly to war crimes already, because there is that's a very dangerous conversation to have and a very dangerous label for our military. However, I 100% agree that the Armed Services Committee on both sides, on the House and Senate, will be learning from the Admiral what actually happened. Obviously, even the president himself said that he would not agree if there was a second strike. So we need to get to the bottom of this on so many levels. I do think that Hegseth on the left is the most favorite to hate in regards to the cabinet secretaries of Trump. Not saying a lot of that has not been at his own doing, but listen, we need to get to the bottom of it. And if there's truly war crimes, let's deal with it. But let's wait and see what actually happens.
We heard Secretary Hegseth say yesterday that he wasn't even in the room when the second strike was ordered. The White House has said that Admiral Bradley is the one who ordered that second strike. Is the administration approaching this question correctly? It seems like they're trying to shift responsibility to others and away from Hegseth. Is that your read of it? And if so, is that the right strategy?
Listen, I think that when you're a cabinet secretary at that level, if he did give that command, I think we will find out. I don't think there's going to be much way for him to get around that, because if supposedly there were other people in the room when it was given. The Admiral knows better as well. I mean, the Admiral would know if there's a second strike that is not allowed. So there does have to be some buck that stops, with him. But listen, it's a dangerous conversation, as I said at the beginning, and I think that do I think that Hegseth will be the fall guy on this at the end of the day? I don't right now, unless something comes out of this that I don't know about sitting here right now. If there is a fall guy or girl, I think it would be probably the Admiral.
We talked to Senator Rand Paul last evening, who was quite spirited in his commentary over this. And we connected the dots this evening. As Paul is chair of the Homeland Security Committee, we spoke with the ranking member a short time ago. The Democrat and Republican agree in this case. Listen to Rand Paul of Kentucky.
I hear some of my colleagues in the hallway just saying, oh, no big deal, we do this all the time. Whenever we bomb people, we just do a second tap on them, man. If they're moving, we go back and hit them again. Well, if it's soldiers with guns shooting our soldiers, I'm fine with that. But this is a pretense of a war. They've just said, oh, we call these people in these boats narco-terrorists so we can kill them without any kind of proof, without any kind of justification, because we say so, because we say it's a war. This is insane. This isn't a war. These people we don't even know if they're armed.
There was a question of whether we're on the march to war. Yeah, well, people are being a little too cool for school about the double tap and the rest of it in Washington now, are they not?
No,
everyone's an armchair warrior when they need to be.
Exactly. But here's what I do think. This issue has been uniting Congress, but especially on both sides of the aisle, on the Armed Services Committee in the House and Senate, because they feel that the administration has not given them enough information. So when Congress is left out, that unites them all. That's so true. I think that they want some answers. Them learning about this through the media is not a good thing. And so, yes, I mean, obviously Rand Paul it's not just Rand. I mean, obviously Rand sometimes can be do his own thing in regards to the budget and things like that. However, there's a lot of other very conservative senators as well that have the same concerns. So not that Rand's not conservative, but you know what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and said, he doesn't think that it'll be easy to reach a deal in negotiations with President Maduro, Venezuela. If that's the case, then what is Republicans' end game here? Are we in for just continued indefinite road strikes? How do Republicans game this out?
I've been following this fairly close because I think that a lot of first of all, the MAGA crew does not want us to get involved in any other wars. Obviously, you have those that level. You also have conservatives that want to deal with this in diplomacy. I think that troops are on the ground is a whole different level. I don't know how much longer. Let's see what comes out of this briefing tomorrow, because if there was the two-tap strike, then I think that those boat strikes will probably be limited a little bit more.
We talked at length about Signalgate when this happened, about security clearances and the rest.
This one,
you knew this is coming. So the IG report drops tomorrow. We understand it will be redacted. I don't know how heavily or what your expectation is, but Bloomberg is already reporting the contents of this case. We had Tony Capaccio with us a bit earlier, saying that they did conclude, the watchdog did conclude, that Hegseth may have put troops at risk. What will come of this report now that it's public?
So I've seen some of that as well. I don't know how heavily redacted it will be, but I think that what I don't see as of right this minute is that there's any fireable offense. I mean, I don't know what he can get. If he did do something in air to put the troops in harm's way, that's one thing. But I don't. Does the report say that he broke this law? I haven't seen.
When
that
you
yet.
add this all up, though, the composite of claims against Pete Hegseth, the walls are closing in here, are they not?
Right, but you know who needs the fire? But one person needs the fire.
Right. So what does he think
I mean,
about
unless he
these
does
headlines?
something illegal, which, we could go through an impeachment situation. But, I mean, Donald Trump's the one that has to make that decision. And and we've had this conversation a lot, Joe, if Trump thinks he's being attacked by the left just because they don't like Pete Hegseth, I'm not saying he hasn't done everything right. That's going to make Donald Trump dig his heels in even more.
Interesting. It's great to have you back, as always. We covered a lot of ground with Ashley.
We did.
Partner at S3 Group, Republican strategist. Always great to have you back. We have breaking news on the terminal once again. They keep hitting this evening. Paramount raising its breakup fee and the Warner Brothers bid now to $5 billion. This is a story that seems to get bigger by the hour, and we'll let you know when we learn more. Coming up as well on Balance of Power, President Trump promising to do away with all documents former President Biden signed with an auto pen, claiming they are null and void. We'll discuss with the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We've got some members, as you know, who want to work with them in a constructive way on something that could be a bipartisan solution, but that hasn't landed yet. So we'll see. As I said, the conversations continue. I don't think at this point we have a clear path forward. I don't think the Democrats have a clear path forward.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. And, of course, the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, speaking yesterday about the impasse that lawmakers are currently facing regarding next steps for a health care plan, or at least an extension. The Majority Leader reiterating that he is waiting for Democratic senators to reveal their plan before his Republican colleagues settle on theirs. Either way, there is a promised vote for next week. And joining us now with his perspective, live from Capitol Hill, is Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it's great to see you, Senator, back on Bloomberg. We understand that the Democrats are working on a 3-year extension of Obamacare subsidies. Is that what you will vote on next week?
I'm not sure that'll be the exact duration of time, but that is the goal, to extend these tax credits to the millions of Americans who were shocked to receive a letter recently that showed what was going to happen to their health insurance premiums. You see, when the Republicans passed the big, beautiful budget bill for the president, they took out the tax credits, which 24 million Americans count on to help pay their health insurance. Now, with that gone, it means it's going to be too expensive for a lot of them. They're going to drop their insurance. It's the last thing they should do.
Well, so timeline sounds like still needs to be hammered out. Will there, in fact, be a bill that gets a floor vote next week?
Well, John Thune, who I respect as a Republican leader, told me personally, yes, I'm going to keep my word and there will be a vote. He said that a couple weeks ago. I think he feels the same way. He should. We need this vote, and we need a dozen or so Republicans to make sure that these tax credits are extended. Listen, they're going to be extended more in red states, Trump states, than in blue states, Democratic states. There are more people affected by it. So for their own constituents who can't afford these health insurance premiums, they should be voting yes with us to extend these tax credits.
But, Senator, many of your Republican colleagues aren't likely to support a straight-up extension of these subsidies. So if the measure, whatever it is next week, doesn't move forward, how are Democrats thinking about what comes next? Because the deadline for these subsidies is quickly approaching.
I can tell you what comes next. There'll be an awful lot of unhappy people, disappointed people, who will wonder why the Republicans let them down. Here's a situation where a dozen Republicans can make a difference in the lives of millions of Americans, extending a law which was on the books for a long period of time. Do we need to do other things in health care? You bet. Sign me up. Let's do it. But for the time being, let's take care of this emergency situation created by the Republicans in their big, beautiful budget bill. Let's help these families keep health insurance in the new year.
Are you at all concerned, Senator, that Democrats could face some political blowback if you all aren't able to come to an agreement before these subsidies expire? After all, it was Democrats who agreed to end the shutdown without this matter having some sort of resolution. Are you concerned that Democrats could face blowback if you all can't come to an agreement?
I think the opposite is true. The Democrats are for extending the tax credits. We've made that clear. I've made that clear. I voted to open up the government for a variety of different reasons. One of them was a promise we'd get a floor vote on this issue this month in December before it takes effect January 1st. So we're getting that opportunity next week. Let's get together, Democrats and Republicans, and solve this immediate problem.
Senator, as ranking member of Judiciary, I'm wondering what you make of some of the pardons that have emerged this week. It's quite a bit of surprise in Washington as the president pursues a military strategy in Venezuela. He pardoned the former Honduras president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into this country, and then just in the last 24 hours decided to pardon Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar, who was indicted on charges of taking bribes. Were these the right moves to make?
I can't keep up with the chaos that has been created by the Trump administration. One hand, they say, we're going to stop the flow of drugs in the United States. Sign me up. I want to be part of that. And then he turns around and releases from prison a man who has been sentenced to 43 years in prison for running one of the biggest narcotic rings in the world out of his country of Honduras, sending drugs to the United States. Wait a minute, Mr. President. I thought we were against the war on drugs. Now you're rewarding the top general in Honduras on the war on drugs, who's sending narcotics to the United States. You can't keep up with President Trump and try to figure out what his logic is. If he wants to stop narcotics, for goodness sakes, he would not have released this man from jail.
Well, it's pretty remarkable to read as well his post about pardoning Henry Cuellar. He writes, Henry, I don't know you, but you can sleep well tonight. Your nightmare is finally over. Are there legality issues here, or can the president truly pardon whoever he wants?
He has a lot of power when it comes to the pardon, and it just seems like he's using it in a random fashion. He gives a full and unconditional pardon to the 1,500 people who mobbed the United States Capitol on January 6th and attacked the policemen who were trying to guard us. He gives them all a full and unconditional pardon. Many of them are back in jail because they have a history of criminal activity. And then he turns around and takes this man who was leading narcotics operations out of Honduras, the president of Honduras, after years of working to prosecute him for his crimes distributing narcotics in the United States, and releases him. He said to explain, a few of his friends asked him to do it. A few of his friends? I mean, this is the President of the United States, and we're talking about life and death issues like narcotics.
Senator, I want to ask you about immigration. There have been increased enforcement efforts in your hometown of Chicago. We know that you sent a letter to Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem over some of these operations. Have you heard back on your letter? And what are you telling some of your constituents about some of these operations that are going on?
I can tell you it's an outrage what's happened in the city of Chicago by Kristi Noem and the Trump administration. They said they were going after those people who were terrorists, murderers, sex offenders, criminally insane, the worst of the worst. Well, let's take a look at the record. How you doing there, Mr. Trump, when it comes to the city of Chicago? Arrested 600 people and detained 600 people. How many of them had any criminal activity in their record? 16. 16 out of 600. 2.5%. For goodness sakes, we're spending millions of dollars activating National Guard, and if we'd given a helping hand to local police, they would have done even better. We didn't need it, and I sent a letter to Kristi Noem saying, here are the documented cases before the federal courts of the outrageous activity of your ICE agents. It has been a terrible mistake for them to send those agents and to send all those resources into Chicago for this purpose.
Pretty remarkable that we're seeing federal agents now touch down in New Orleans, Senator. They're calling it Operation Catahoula Crunch, with plans to round up some 5,000 immigrants in the city of New Orleans. Does the Judiciary Committee have a response to this use of our Border Patrol and ICE agents in cities like New Orleans? What's about to happen here?
Well, this Democrat on the Judiciary Committee has a response. People in New Orleans are going to be shocked at the activities and the standards that are used by these ICE agents. We've seen it in Chicago. They don't care where you're from, where you were born, whether you're a citizen or not. They're going to detain you, arrest you, and not even follow due process. They ended up with a handful, 16 people they find who might have been guilty of some crime and been on the streets. I'd like to get them all off the streets, but look at the millions of dollars that could have been spent more effectively to get that done. Now it's coming to New Orleans. Pretty soon it may come to another city near you.
Senator, you're set to introduce the DREAM Act once again. We know this is a bill that you have championed over many years, but you will be introducing it again against a very difficult backdrop, as we've been talking about stricter immigration enforcement, fear in many immigrant communities about stricter immigration enforcement. Is there a message that you are trying to send as you introduce this bill again against that difficult backdrop?
800,000 people brought to the United States when they were infants and toddlers by their parents who made the decision. Grew up in this country, kept their nose clean, went to school, got a job, worked hard, paid their taxes, and I believe they should have a chance to become citizens. So President Obama creates a DACA program. Every 2 years they got to come forward, pay a fee, go through a complete background check as to any criminal activity. Every 2 years, year after year. 800,000 of them. They're making America a better nation. I think that ought to be a permanent basis, and that's why I introduced the bill.
It's great to have you back, Senator. We appreciate the time. Dick Durbin, the Democrat from Illinois, with us live from Capitol Hill. We thank you. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter if you want to pursue all the stories that we talked about this evening. Several of them broke since we've been on the air. Go to the terminal and online. Tomorrow, Amera is going to be a big one as we get this IG report that we've been discussing here this evening. We'll get the redacted version, but let's remember that IG report into Signalgate was already given to the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, and that's where the leaks usually begin.
Yeah, the Pentagon saying nothing to see here, so we'll see.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Be with us for more as we dissect the contents of that report and keep tabs on the Admiral's testimony. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Amera Omokwe, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.